It's not easy to find one's true path, and some people only manage to do so in their later years. Unfortunately, by that time, a person may have already made many unpleasant acquaintances, and it can become dangerous. Today, we want to tell the story of vile hypocrisy and malice that led to a tragedy. Joseph Sonnier was born in 1955 into a well-respected family of physicians in Shreveport, Louisiana, USA, and from childhood, he wanted to follow in his family's footsteps. He graduated with honors in medical sciences from the University of Baton Rouge in 1976, and then completed his studies at Louisiana State University in Shreveport. While attending university, Joseph worked at Parkland Hospital in Dallas, Texas, where he rose to become the chief resident in his final year of training. He became a pathologist and a partner in a laboratory, which he later sold. At the time of the events described, Dr. Sonnier was still employed as the lab's director and was also listed as the chief pathologist for the Covenant Health System in Lubbock, Texas. Dr. Joseph Sonnier was a respected and wealthy pathologist, making him quite a catch for any woman. He was a single man, famous, enjoying his freedom, his status, and his wealth. However, it wasn't always this way, as he had married his high school sweetheart Becky at the age of 19. The couple had 2 sons together. Sonnier was a fairly strict father, but it paid off. He believed in strict discipline for young boys, and his sons grew up to be responsible and decent men. Initially, the family was doing well, but after 27 years of marriage, Becky fell in love with another man. She honestly told her husband about this, and they eventually divorced. However, Becky's new relationship did not lead to a happy future, as her new lover turned out to be a dangerous man. Sometime after their marriage, he shot her, their dog, and then himself. Fortunately, the children, who were already adults and living separately, were not harmed in this tragedy. Dr. Sonnier was shocked by the brutal death of his ex-wife, but he had no idea that his own future would also be tainted with blood. As the years passed, Joseph continued to support his 2 sons. In 2007, he moved from Dallas to Lubbock to start a new life. Joseph planned to continue working while enjoying life, trying things he hadn't yet had the chance to appreciate, such as dancing. He started taking dance lessons, which brought him a lot of joy, especially as it allowed him to meet different women. He didn't give up hope of finding love. Over time, he attempted to form relationships with his dance partners, but nothing worked out. This went on for quite a while until, in July 2011, 57-year-old Joseph met the woman who, as it turned out, would become his destiny. Her name was Tina, a 47-year-old stunning and charming woman, almost 10 years younger than him. Before they met, Rachel had been a high-ranking executive in the NFL for a long time, building a successful career and wanting for nothing. She also had 4 children of her own, all of whom were grown. The couple had many things in common, and it's no wonder they hit it off quickly and fell deeply in love after some time. They spent more and more time together. Rachel's birthday was celebrated in Paris, and then Joseph took her to Los Angeles to introduce her to his family. The pathologist's wealth made it easy to take trips, regardless of their scale or cost. The relationship developed so quickly that the couple began to wish for marriage. At that time, Joseph had no idea that his new lover was a real ticking time bomb and that being with her would turn out to be dangerous. On July 11, 2012, the situation spiraled out of control. A landscaper who had come to the doctor's house to discuss an upcoming renovation called 911. He reported that when he arrived at his client's house to inspect the patio, he couldn't reach the homeowner. However, he noticed the door was open. The landscaper assumed that Joseph simply hadn't heard him. The man entered the house and began calling out for him. The gardener saw chaos inside, and most suspiciously, he noticed a bullet hole in a window near the front door. It all looked like a break-in, and it was worrying. He cautiously continued inside, looking for the homeowner, but found no trace of him. The gardener then made his way to the garage, where he found Dr. Sonnier lying in a pool of blood with no signs of life. He had both gunshot and stab wounds on his body. The worker immediately exited the house and called 911. The call came in at 2:48 p.m., and the police quickly dispatched several patrols to the scene. When the officers arrived, they found the crime victim, quickly identified as 57-year-old Joseph Sonnier. Paramedics declared the renowned pathologist dead at the scene. This horrific crime took place in one of the calmest, safest, and most prestigious neighborhoods in the city. There was virtually no crime in this area, so the event shook the entire community. The wealthy pathologist had no enemies, and all of his friends and family described him as one of the calmest and kindest people they knew. He belonged to a prestigious profession and had no apparent enemies who would want to harm him. It was immediately clear that this was not a robbery, as nothing had been stolen from the house. However, a window had been broken, and a bottle with a shot-out bottom was found at the scene, which seemed to have been used as an improvised silencer for a gun. Investigators determined that the victim had been dead for some time when he was found. The blood had dried, the body was cold, and rigor mortis had set in. An estimated time of death was established, revealing that the man had died during the night. Crime scene investigators immediately arrived to determine the circumstances of the crime and gather evidence for the investigation. Ample evidence was available, as the attacker appeared to have left plenty behind, showing they were likely not a professional, but rather an amateur. DNA from the bottle, used as a silencer, was collected at the scene, as well as blood samples from 2 people. All of this evidence was sent to the lab for analysis. Neighboring residents reported seeing and hearing nothing suspicious, and there were no surveillance cameras nearby. Investigators deduced that the attacker had entered through the back door, using a large panoramic window that overlooked the backyard, a route favorable for a surprise attack. Inside the dining room, the attacker confronted his victim, which was when shots were fired. The wine bottle was probably used as a silencer at this point, though it didn't work. The doctor seemed to have been alive after that, as blood trails were found along the corridor leading to the garage, where the attacker began stabbing him, ultimately resulting in his death. An autopsy of the victim revealed 5 gunshot wounds and 11 stab wounds. Initially, detectives didn't believe this was a random crime, but they needed to figure out who had done it and why. Naturally, the first people they investigated were the pathologist's family and children, all of whom were in shock. Just 2 years earlier, their mother, Becky, had been shot by her new husband, and now their father had been killed in a similarly brutal manner. It seemed too coincidental for lightning to strike twice in the same family. Joseph's murder was the second devastating blow for the children, following the emotional torment of their biological mother's death. Within 2 years, they found themselves parentless. The brutal killing of Becky had deeply wounded Dr. Sonnier, a man who had spent nearly 3 decades of his life with her. He often reminisced about the years they spent together, mourning her loss. Despite his grief, he remained strong and became a pillar of support for his family, handling all the funeral arrangements and covering the expenses while helping his sons cope with the trauma. Later, the children admitted that it was their father's support that helped each of them overcome the pain. The sons of the victim had no idea who would want to harm their father. He was a rock for many people, not just for the family, but also for his friends and colleagues. He was a charming, likable man with a fortune estimated at around $12 million, yet he never flaunted his wealth, preferring to stay humble. All of this made him one of the most desirable bachelors of his age in the city. Naturally, many women were attracted to him, and this became particularly noticeable when he started taking dance lessons. Since then, the charismatic millionaire had no shortage of attention from interested women. It was through dancing that he also met his new lover, Rochelle, who was readily accepted by the entire family. Rochelle was beautiful, cheerful, and fun. After meeting, the couple began to relax together at the best restaurants and private clubs in the city, as well as in more private settings. Joseph spared no effort when it came to his beloved, showering her with gifts. At this point, Rachel was 47 years old and completely enamored with her new partner. Numerous confirmations of her feelings were found, particularly in the many posts on her personal social media pages, where Rachel openly declared her love for the wealthy doctor. This was also confirmed by multiple witnesses, friends, and acquaintances familiar with the couple, who had high hopes for their relationship. Joseph had been single for a long time and hadn't been able to start a new family, but it seemed that now a worthy woman had finally come into his life, and he was ready to marry her. The person closest to the victim was, without a doubt, his girlfriend Rachel, with whom he was inseparable. Naturally, the investigators spoke with her first. She described the deceased as the love of her life and said she could never have imagined something like this happening to him. She was deeply distraught by the events and didn't know what to do. During her conversation with the police, Rachel shared some strange details. She said that in the months leading up to the tragedy, odd things had been happening in the lives of the couple. Joseph seemed to be the victim of stalking, something he had confided to his fiancée about repeatedly. Rachel also mentioned that she herself had once seen a stranger who looked quite eerie standing outside their house on a rainy night, watching the door and windows as if observing them. However, she couldn't see his face clearly. Despite these unsettling events, Rachel said her fiancé tried to turn everything into a joke, seemingly underestimating the seriousness of the situation. Rachel also mentioned that Joseph had received multiple strange calls and threats in the months before his death, which were followed by a series of threatening text messages. After reflecting on the events, Rachel named several individuals she thought might be potential suspects. However, the police initially doubted her suggestions, suspecting that jealousy might have been one possible motive. Thanks to a few witnesses, the police learned that Joseph had been involved with multiple women at the time of his death. This prompted the investigators to ask Rachel if she knew whether her fiancé might have been involved in any extramarital relationships. She responded that she wasn't aware of any such affairs and denied that Joseph would have done anything like that, stating that it wasn't in his character. Joseph's sons also refuted the allegations, insisting that their father was a decent man who would never cheat. Faced with the obvious suspicions of the police, Rachel maintained her innocence. During her next interview, however, she broke down in tears and admitted that she knew several women who might have been involved in the murder. According to Rachel, there were several ex-girlfriends who had continuously harassed the doctor, with the pressure increasing in the months leading up to his death. Joseph had ignored them, but they had continued to bother him, unhappy that he was in a serious relationship with Rachel and preparing for marriage. One of these women was a dance instructor from Florida, who kept calling and texting him, even after Joseph had informed her of his serious relationship with Rachel. Rachel also suspected that a nurse, with whom the pathologist had worked some time ago, might be involved, as she too had been calling and texting him regularly. The third woman was someone with a daughter who had sent a threatening letter to Joseph shortly before the murder, accusing him of abandoning her and her child, which wasn't true. In addition to these women, Rachel was one of the first to point to Thomas Dixon, a plastic surgeon who worked at his private clinic. He specialized in cosmetic treatments and plastic surgery, and his clinic was located in another city. There was a possibility that Dixon had a motive to harm Joseph, as Rachel had been his former lover, and their breakup had been difficult. Thomas and Rachel had met in 2008 when she visited his clinic for Botox injections. Initially, their relationship was friendly, with light flirting, but it soon blossomed into an affair. The doctor began cheating on his wife with Rachel. After a few months, his wife found out and filed for divorce, but this didn't seem to bother the plastic surgeon. He was so deeply in love with Rachel that he divorced his wife, with whom he had been married for about 20 years. Thomas was determined to be with Rachel, and they continued their relationship only to break up again in 2010. Rachel described Thomas as a manipulative man who tried to control everything, including her freedom. He had stalked her for a long time, demanding that she return to him, which prompted Rachel to move away in order to escape him. After considering all the circumstances, Rachel came to believe that her ex, Thomas Dixon, had been the one stalking Joseph in the months leading up to his death. She revealed that the final stage of their relationship had been a nightmare, a roller coaster ride that had taken a serious toll on her. Rachel described her ex as a womanizer who couldn't resist any woman, and she said he tended toward emotional abuse, which led to their breakup. The main reason, she explained, was that Thomas was always lying, pretending to be something he wasn't. Once Rachel saw his true self, she was disappointed. Even after she moved to another city, Thomas tracked her down and continued to harass her. According to Rachel, he became emotionally desperate when he found out she was with another man. Realizing that he could no longer win her back, he even proposed the idea of them continuing their relationship despite her new relationship. He suggested a love triangle, which Rachel categorically refused. After that, she said she began to feel constantly stalked, and Joseph had also mentioned it to her. One time, she and her lover saw something that looked like a camera flash through a backyard window, but they only realized the seriousness of the problem later. Thomas Dixon quickly became a person of interest to the investigators, and they wanted to speak with him. The plastic surgeon lived 2 hours away from Lubbock, and the police officers went to question him, as he was now the main suspect in the case. Dixon willingly agreed to talk to the police. He admitted that he had indeed been madly in love with Rachel and had made many changes in his life for her, including divorcing his wife. He did everything he could to stay with Rachel, but unfortunately, they eventually broke up, which was a heavy blow for him. Dixon confessed that, for a time, he had been stalking her, but not to threaten her, he claimed. Rather, he wanted to win her back. Despite his efforts, Rachel continued to reject him, and Dixon eventually gave up and found another woman. At the time of the crime, Dixon was in a relationship with a medical student much younger than him. He insisted that he had moved on from Rachel, was no longer pursuing her, and certainly had nothing to do with her fiancé's murder. Dixon's new girlfriend served as his alibi. She confirmed that he had been at work and later with her when the crime took place. Additionally, solid evidence, including video footage, backed up his alibi, showing that everyone connected to the case had accounted for their whereabouts, including Rachel herself. Investigators then sought out people who might have had a grudge against Joseph, envied him, or wanted to take advantage of him. However, no new suspects surfaced. Meanwhile, the lab results came back, revealing that the DNA from the bottle did not belong to Joseph. One of the blood samples found at the scene matched Sonnier's, but the police database couldn't identify the other sample, meaning it would need to be compared with potential suspects to confirm guilt. The problem, however, was that there were no obvious suspects. A few days later, the police station received a call from an aspiring paramedic from Amarillo named Paul Reynolds. He claimed to live with a roommate who had recently confessed to the murder of Joseph Sonnier and had attempted suicide afterward, but was saved. Paul's roommate was named David Shepard. According to the witness, the murderer told him how he had broken into the house and shot the man, providing details that were only known to a small circle of investigators, such as the use of the wine bottle as a silencer. An outsider could not have known these details, making it clear that David was indeed informed about the crime. The police quickly turned their attention to the new suspect. They discovered that David Shepard had a violent criminal history, which included theft and vandalism, though nothing too serious had happened so far. David was divorced and unemployed, but had been involved in multiple thefts, including one from a prominent businessman. Paul described David as sociable, but somewhat incoherent, not making a particularly threatening impression. According to Paul, David had been hired by a plastic surgeon to carry out the murder, but he didn't know the doctor's name. A friend of David's, who contacted the police, reported that David had been in a depressive state in recent days, constantly drunk and under the influence of illegal substances. He behaved irrationally and seemed ready to take his own life. In this condition, the killer began telling Paul what had happened, and Paul decided to inform the police. When investigators came to speak with the new suspect, David became visibly nervous. He gave confused answers to their questions and appeared highly suspicious. When confronted with what the police knew, he gradually confessed that he had been hired by the plastic surgeon Thomas Dixon to commit the murder. David then laid out in detail the sequence of events from that fateful day. David said that he had met the plastic surgeon in a bar, and it turned out they had a lot in common, as both were going through difficult breakups with their partners at the time. Over a few drinks, they struck up a friendship, bonding over their shared experiences and trying to find comfort in each other. Thomas opened up about his sad love story, recounting how Rachel had left him and was now with another man. He explained that this breakup had deeply affected him, as he was madly in love with her and couldn't forget her. Dr. Dixon had made numerous changes in his life to be with Rachel, even planning to marry her, but she had left him regardless. Thomas was determined to get Rachel back, and he believed that to do so, he needed to eliminate the one obstacle standing in his way, Dr. Sonnier. He believed that once Joseph was out of the picture, Rachel would come back to him. David sympathized with his new friend and agreed to help him in his mission. Together, they devised a plan, though initially it wasn't supposed to involve murder. Their plan was to defame Joseph by tarnishing his reputation, making Rachel leave him. The first part of the plan involved exaggerating the harassment claims from Joseph's ex-girlfriends and making it seem like Joseph was a terrible person. They even wrote a letter from a supposed ex-lover accusing Joseph of abandoning her, but Rachel didn't believe it. When this plan failed, it became clear that the two conspirators were prepared to go further to achieve their goal. They turned to Plan B, murder. Thomas Dixon decided that the only way to win Rachel back was to kill Joseph Sonnier, as ruining his reputation hadn't worked. Dixon was convinced that after Joseph's death, Rachel would come crawling back to him. To execute this plan, Thomas needed David's help. As payment, Dixon offered David 3 silver bars, valued at around $5,000 in total. David agreed, and Thomas immediately gave him one of the bars as a down payment. David then took it to a pawn shop and cashed it in. He told the police how they prepared for the crime, with Dr. Dixon providing him with a gun. David's task was to follow Joseph, learn his daily routine, and figure out the best time to strike. He kept a close eye on the victim, and the plastic surgeon remained in constant contact with him, monitoring Joseph's whereabouts in real time. On the appointed day, David arrived at Joseph's home before he returned, positioning himself on a chair in the backyard. He was wearing a cap, safety goggles, and carried a bag. He waited patiently for Joseph to come home, armed with a gun that had a wine bottle attached to the barrel as a makeshift silencer, along with gloves and a knife. The gun was meant to be the primary weapon, but the knife was kept as a backup in case the gun failed. David also had a belt, which he planned to use to strangle the victim if both the gun and the knife didn't work. Throughout the crime, and in the lead-up, Dixon and David exchanged messages. This correspondence was later uncovered and became one of the key pieces of evidence during the trial. The crime, however, did not go according to plan from the very beginning. When Joseph arrived home late that night, he noticed an intruder on his back porch. He approached and knocked on the window from the inside, trying to get David's attention and scare him off. The would-be victim politely asked David what he was doing on his private property. In response, the intruder pulled out a gun and fired several shots at Joseph through the now shattered window. After that, David reached inside the broken window and fired more shots, but even then, Joseph wasn't killed. Joseph tried to flee down the hallway, and David, fearing that Joseph might have a weapon to defend himself, immediately followed him. He caught up with Joseph in the garage and began stabbing him repeatedly. After a few stabs, the pathologist fell to the ground, showing no signs of life. David then inflicted 3 or 4 more stabs to vital organs to ensure Joseph was dead. David rushed back to the car and reported everything in detail to his employer. When he returned, he immediately received the remaining 2 silver bars, along with a box of Cuban cigars, as a thank you for his work. Dr. Dixon listened intently to the report, treated and bandaged David's wounds from the struggle, and advised him to lay low for a while. Evidence supporting David's confession was abundant. For example, a photo accidentally left on his phone showed him posing in front of a mirror inside Joseph's house. Additionally, DNA samples collected at the crime scene matched David's, and location data from his phone confirmed that he was at the victim's house at the time of the murder. Dr. Thomas Dixon was arrested on charges of first-degree murder based on David's confession and a large amount of supporting evidence, including incriminating phone calls and text messages exchanged between the conspirators. When the police first questioned Dixon, they hoped to get a confession from the mastermind behind the murder. However, Dixon was visibly shaken and clumsily claimed that he didn't even understand which Dr. Sonnier they were talking about. When the police pressed him with the evidence, Dixon quickly requested a lawyer. The case went to trial, with David Shepard agreeing to cooperate with the prosecution as part of a plea deal. He immediately pled guilty to being the hired killer. As part of the deal, he waived his right to appeal the verdict, and in return, he was spared the death penalty. Instead, he received a life sentence without the possibility of parole. Thomas Dixon, on the other hand, was much harder to crack. He continued to maintain his innocence during the trial. The prosecution charged him with capital murder, but chose not to seek the death penalty, likely because they believed the jury wouldn't unanimously agree on such a harsh sentence. Although there was significant evidence against Dixon, most of it was circumstantial. His defense team worked hard to paint a flawless picture of him as a well-respected professional with an impeccable reputation, both at work and in his personal life. The defense lawyers challenged David's testimony and even questioned the authenticity and relevance of the messages exchanged between Dixon and David. Despite the prosecution's best efforts, the jury ultimately found Dixon not guilty in his first trial. Much of the confusion stemmed from David, who, while testifying under a plea deal, appeared to favor Dixon, claiming that he had planned and executed the murder all by himself. 2 jurors from the first trial expressed reasonable doubt, leading to a mistrial. But the Sonnier family didn't give up. The case was reopened, and in 2016, a new trial took place. This time, after reviewing all the case materials, the jury deliberated for about 3 hours before coming to the conclusion that Dixon was indeed guilty of first-degree murder. Since the prosecution had not sought the death penalty, Dixon was automatically sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. One of the key pieces of evidence leading to his conviction was provided by his own daughter, who presented damning information during the trial. Additionally, Paul Reynolds, who initially called the police, testified about how David had confessed to him that Dixon had hired him for the murder. Dixon's daughter also revealed that her father had tried to cover for his accomplice. Despite the overwhelming evidence, Dr. Dixon continued to claim his innocence, insisting that he had nothing to do with the death of his romantic rival, Dr. Joseph Sonnier. Dixon was not satisfied with the court's decision, and his lawyers filed an appeal, which eventually led to the overturning of his conviction. Dixon was released on a $2 million bail, but the fight for justice wasn't over yet. In 2019, the state prosecutor's office filed a petition with the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals, asking for the reinstatement of the previous verdict. If the appeal was unsuccessful, a third trial was likely to take place. The prosecutor's request was filed on February 11, 2019, and the next phase of the legal process occurred in April 2020. During this time, Dixon's bail was revoked and a new arrest warrant was issued against him. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals overturned the earlier ruling, reinstating Dixon's conviction. The judge concluded that Dixon should continue serving his life sentence without parole. Dixon is currently behind bars in a Lubbock, Texas, correctional facility. Throughout all the legal turmoil and media attention, Rachel, the woman who became the central figure in the conflict between the two men, sought to lead a quiet, peaceful life, staying out of the public eye. Although she remained in the same town, she kept herself shielded from journalists and the public. In 2016, she even filed a lawsuit against a magazine that had published an article describing her involvement in a love triangle with both the victim and the murderer. The article portrayed her as a gold-digging woman who destroyed marriages, which she vehemently denied. Rachel sought $2 million in moral damages, but her claim was rejected. Despite her reluctance to make her life public, Rachel spoke to the media on a few occasions. She expressed feelings of guilt for having unwittingly brought a criminal into the life of a truly loving and honest man. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to the channel and like. See you in the next video.